Behold, the bridegroom cometh. Go ye out to meet him. Now is the time to trim your lamps and get ready for the coming of the Lord. Stay tuned for the Midnight Cry broadcast.
Praise God. Good to see everybody today. The Lord is good, isn't He? Well, I'd like to, if the Lord can help me, to go to several very familiar scriptures, passages, things that happened in the life of Jesus, and share some very simple truths that affect every one of us. There's nothing revolutionary in anything that I expect to say this morning, but I need it, so if you don't mind listening in, that would be all right. But anyway, let's begin in John chapter 4. I don't know how many of these passages we'll get to, but let's just see what the Lord does. John chapter 4, we know this is the passage where Jesus was leaving Jerusalem and traveling back to his own home territory in Galilee, and in between was Samaria. And so they arrive hungry, thirsty, the middle of the day, Jesus and the disciples, and they leave Jesus by the town well, and the disciples go on into town to buy food. They're taking care of some of the practical needs. And so all of this takes place, and I'll just largely refer to what happened. Of course, we know that there was a woman who came out to draw water. Now, let's step back into history just for a moment and see where, what led to all of this. You look back into the history of Israel, following Solomon's reign, they reached the great zenith of power and control and influence. Solomon was the greatest king on the planet in his day. Everybody knew about Solomon. But after Solomon died, the kingdom split. There was a rebellion, there was a revolt, and 10 of the tribes became known from that point on as Israel. They lived in the north. They established a capital in a city called Samaria. And the southern kingdom was known as Judah, and they continued on for a number of centuries that way. But the northern kingdom of Israel never ever served God. They had kings like Ahab, they had prophets like Elijah, but in spite of everything, from the moment they established their kingdom, they established a separate center of worship. They embraced many of the heathen gods, and things just went downhill. And I believe, I didn't check the exact chronology, but it's something like a couple of hundred years before the Babylonian captivity, is the one we think of so much, that came and destroyed Jerusalem. God finally had enough of the northern kingdom, and he allowed the Assyrian Empire to come in and basically do some business there and destroy the kingdom. Assyria was a great empire that ruled the earth, the known area of the earth, before Babylon came on. And what the man did, the ruler of Assyria, actually fulfilled the very prophecies, the things that God had warned him. He says, if you don't serve me, if you go after the heathen gods, I'm going to scatter you to the ends of the earth. Well, that's exactly what happened. And in order to control the population, in order to rule what he did, they uprooted, if not all, at least a substantial portion of the population of Israel, and scattered them throughout his kingdom. In fact, it's very interesting. I was recalling something some of you may have seen in the news sometime in the last few years. There was a population, a small group of people from India who kept applying to the nation of Israel and saying, we're Jews, we want to come home. And they actually finally convinced the Israeli government that yes, they were. And I forget what tribe they had, but their tradition was they were part of a certain tribe, and it was one of those tribes. So here's a group over in India that goes all the way back to that history of that emperor scattering these people. And that's one reason you find Jews just about everywhere throughout that region of the world. They were transplanted. Well, what happened was, now you've got empty towns, and so what he did was to bring people from Babylon, from many other places in his empire, and resettle the land. And so now you had foreign peoples. You probably had some Jews that remained, some of the poor ones. We don't know for sure. But one of the interesting things that happened was that as soon as they got there, lions started eating them. And, one of the ideas that virtually all of the peoples of the earth had was that there were gods who ruled certain territories. And so if you went to a certain place, you better know about that God and what you need to do in the way of rituals and observances to get along with him, all right? And so otherwise disaster is going to come upon you. So I believe the Lord, you can see the Lord's hand in this to actually kind of get their attention a little bit. And so they called the emperor and said, hey, we're getting eaten of lions. We don't know how to appease the God of this land. Send us a teacher. And so he got hold of a Levite who came and taught them about Jehovah. But what they wound up doing was kind of having a mixture. They sort of worshiped God, but they worshiped their heathen gods too, the ones they brought with them from their native countries. Later on, they actually turned away somewhat from their idolatry, and they had their own little tradition, their religion that was built on the religion of Moses. And so you find this woman coming and saying to Jesus, you Jews say Jerusalem is where you ought to worship, and our fathers worshipped on this mountain. Which is the way it is? Which is it? And you can see where that tradition comes from if you go back through the history. So here's this woman. Her people had been brought from the far ends of the earth, settled in this land. But I'll tell you, there was a God who was looking down the path of time and saw a woman who was going to be in need. Now, everything, we've mentioned this before, everything about this situation was, if you'd gone by the traditions and the ways of the people of that region, this would never have happened. Now, in the first place, Jews did not have dealings with Samaritans. They were considered foreigners. They were, at best, half-breeds. Their religion was a corruption of what they believed to be true, and so they just didn't have any dealings with Samaritans. Well, on top of that, she was a woman. Now, even if she had been a Jewish woman, it would not have been normal for a high religious teacher to be stooping to talk to a woman. I'm sorry about that, ladies. That's the way it was. That's not the way it's supposed to be, but that is the way it was. So, and on top of that, this lady was an outcast in her own people. I mean, why was she coming alone in the middle of the day? This was not the time when people came to draw water. Why didn't it say they all came out and he just happened to talk to one? No, there was one lady who came out by herself. Why? This lady had a past. She was, as it came out in the story, she was living with somebody, and she had had 5 husbands. Jesus said the one you're living with now is not your husband. And, all this background tumbled out of her past. And yet, we see the Lord of glory coming down and talking with this woman and actually opening his heart to her, revealing who he was to her, giving her a sense of hope. And the obvious message is that her past was not an impediment to God working in her life and receiving her and loving her. And it's amazing, and you'll see this over and over again in the encounters people had with Jesus, that all they had to do was encounter him. Number one, it made them very conscious of what they were. There was no hiding. They knew they could not say, I am righteous, I'm this, I'm that. Now, the Pharisees tried to do that, but I mean the common people who really sensed his spirit. There was something about him that made their sins, made them very self-conscious of their sin, of their past, of all that was wrong. And yet, in the very presence of such a convicting presence of God, there was a sense of love. There was a sense that I love you anyway. There is hope going forward. Your past does not stop me. You can begin again today. And so she was excited. She ran back into her village, and she told the people, come and see someone who's told me everything I ever did. Is this not the Christ? Now that right there, that lets you know that how much they had embraced of, the Old Testament and its traditions. Even though they had kind of a garbled view of it, they still believed in the coming of a Messiah. Now, don't you see the hand of God transplanting people from the ends of the earth, bringing them there, giving them a certain amount of knowledge, preparing them? And we know from the record of the New Testament that even though Jesus was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, here he is in a Samaritan village,